Thank you, Liz. Thank you for... I'll do my best to be entertaining. Maybe I'll tell you a little bit about where I began, which was with the Herald and Weekly Times before that I didn't exist really. 1955 I joined the Herald and Weekly Times as a reporter, and in 1958 I was sent to New York because in those days newspapers like the Herald and Weekly Times were enormously rich. Didn't know what to do with their money. There were 14 people in the London Bureau, half a dozen in New York. There were people in Tokyo, Singapore, Bangkok, Paris, you name it. And the Herald and Weekly Times had a correspondent there. And because of that richness, the wealth, they also sent young people to their foreign bureaus. So in 1958, having been the Herald motor rider for a bit, I was sent to New York, and there I spent 3 years there. I followed the Kennedy election train into Washington DC and saw a bit of Camelot. I watched Khrushchev bang his shoe on the desk in the UN, and I went to Cuba, against which sanctions had just been imposed by the United States. And I met Che Guevara and Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway was, pardon the Chinese, but he was pissed as a newt in the Florida bar, and we were having, he was talking about Australia as if it was something like the Wild West, and he was reliving his past in the Spanish Civil War and things like that. It was about 12 months before he committed suicide with a shotgun when he was back in the United States. But he was entertaining. In the middle of all this, after about the 14th frozen daiquiri, his wife, who was Miss Mary, was about this big, came in to the bar and rushed across and accused me of getting Hemingway drunk. And I suggested that Hemingway had been drunk for some years. She ignored me and took him away. Guevara was interesting. He was a great poser in a way. He was always in the beret and the khakis and things like that. And I was picked up from the Florida bar on another night, as it happened, and by a bunch of goons in a large ancient Chevrolet, and delivered to the Banco Nacional and taken up to the top floor where Guevara was acting as the president of the National Bank, despite the fact the National Bank had no money. And the room was enormous. The office was about as big as this theaterette. There was an enormous mahogany desk over sort of here, and nothing on it except a gourd with a brass tube of mate, which is a sort of semi-narcotic drink that a lot of Latin Americans drink, and a 9mm pistol, which I noticed had its safety off, and he was playing with it and spinning it on the desk. And every time it would stop pointing at me, he smiled, which I thought at least was friendly of him, because he didn't pull the trigger. From America, I was posted to Southeast Asia, and I spent from 1962 until 1969-70 covering events in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, the Philippines, got out as far as India and Burma, and across to Indonesia, covered the fall of Sukarno and the rise of Suharto, the massacre of what's suggested is about 100,000 people in Bali, and things like that. And I left there in about 1970, spent 2 years back in Melbourne as a group foreign editor, and then was posted to London, head of the European Bureau, which in those days had 14 odd people in it, and we had plenty of money. And so we covered Europe quite comfortably, and I was there till for 8 odd years. And then I was posted to as the managing director of the Fiji Times and Herald, which was a bit like descending from, I don't know, the Royal Opera House to, I won't describe it. It was charming, socially wonderful, but if you're trying to run a business there and report to an Australian company, it was a nightmare. One example, I had the contract for, most of my money came from printing. I had 400 people on the payroll, and we printed sticky labels and we printed all sorts of things, textbooks for the University of Hawaii. And among the things we printed were Carlton and United beer labels. And that was on a press that didn't stop. It was called a Planeta, built in Germany. And one night, about 1 in the morning, Magnus Mitchell, the the printing manager, called me up and said, "You better come down to the plant." I said, "What's wrong?" He said, "Come down." So okay, got up, put on the pajamas, got in the car, went down to the plant, and as I pulled up, noticed that it was totally silent. Now normally it made a lot of noise, 24 hours, 7 days a week, but it was silent. So even in my half asleep state, I figured something was wrong. So I went in there and they were all gathered around the Planeta, which had stopped, which is unusual. And I wandered over and I said to Magnus, "What happened?" And he said, "Charlie got drunk." Charlie was the guy running the Planeta at the time. "What happened then?" "Forgot to tighten the safety bar." "What happened then?" "Bar fell into the press." The bar is about 4 inches by an inch of solid steel, and it dropped straight into the cylinders of the press, which immediately stopped. When we took the covers off, half the teeth on the main drive gear, which is about that round, had gone, and various other things are all twisted and bent. Now, one of the features of being in the islands is that there's absolutely no support for anything. So there were no spares. New Zealand had no spares. Australia had no spares. Nobody wanted to touch it, so I had to bring from Germany, from Dresden, the engineer who had built the press, fly him out, put him up for 3 months. He measured all the damaged stuff. They had to cut new wheels. I lost 5 months worth of production. I lost the beer label contract. And anyway, it was all running again. I called Magnus Mitchell in and I said, "Now, who's going to run the press, the Planeta?" He said, "Oh, Charlie." And I said, "Over my dead body, does he run?" He said, No, it's Charlie's job." He said, "Nobody else will touch it." "Okay, well, where's Charlie?" "Well, he's up in the village." "I think we'd better go and have a small word with him." So we sat round the carver bowl in Charlie's village with Charlie. He was purely contrite, and I explained to him that, almost seriously, that if he ever got drunk again, if he ever messed up again, then somebody would appear and would take him out in the lagoon and sink him with a load of bricks. I'm a reasonably good actor, and I think that he understood that he was on borrowed time. So when I left Fiji shortly thereafter, Charlie was happily running the Planeta. As far as I know, it's still working. Anyway, I came back from Fiji, and being fairly senior, and the Herald didn't know what to do with me. So I wound up with leading newspapers, which in a way introduced me to the Macintosh, because at that point the Herald Weekly Times was working on the technology of colour printing of photographs on high-speed offset newspaper presses. And I was given a little department to fool around with this, and a couple of guys that understood that sort of thing, square dots and round dots and triangular dots and this sort of thing. And so we used Mac Power PCs. I think 7200s and quadros. And that was fine, and then I finally Murdoch took over the H&WT ad leader, and after a time I departed for the Age, and because of that experience I was made production editor of Computer Age, which in those days was 28 broadsheet pages, and made many millions of dollars from the employment ads. And I started, because of my experience with Macs, I started the MacMan column, and that was in 1994, when Apple was really at the bottom of the barrel. It was, I suppose, if they were honest and the accountants were honest, it was trading insolvent, probably. It was close to bankruptcy, if not bankrupt. Scully had gone, Spindler was in, and you know, it was changing CEOs. And then Don Emilio came in, and Jobs, I think knowing what was going to happen, or what he intended to happen, Jobs talked Emilio into buying Next Computer, which was the company that Jobs had set up by selling his Apple shares all bar one. I'd have forgotten how much they were worth then, and setting up Next. Now, there were two people that he recruited to Next. One was Avi Tavanian, who was an expert in Unix, and the other was John Rubinstein, who later became Jobs and Apple's production manager, the job that Tim Cook had before he rose to his current eminence. And Rubinstein was the guy who ensured that the computers were built. And they became the core of Jobs' team, along with people like Jeff Raskin and whatnot, who had Raskin, I guess everybody here would know, developed the graphical user interface, and he was at Xerox PARC in the great days when the mouse was whittled and great things happened, and the Alto was made, Alto computer, which was the first computer with a GUI. And Jobs was charmed by that machine. Anyway, things got better when Jobs took over. The year after he assumed as the CEO, he made a profit of, I think, $53 million. The following year, 110 million. So then the stories, instead of being in the death, the hatch-match and the spats pages about Apple is dead, you know, along with Microsoft and IBM in those days, suddenly Apple was back, and the shares started to rise. And back then, even back then, which would have been 1998 probably, a little before, it was the fastest growing company on the New York Stock Exchange in terms of shares and growth. Anyway, it was about that time that I began to go to Macworld expos and meet various people, among them Steve Jobs. I interviewed Steve Jobs, a curious man. When I walked, this was in Tokyo, and when I walked I was ushered into this enormous suite on the top of the New Otani Hotel. Living room was certainly as long as this room, with a great bench and a couple of Mac Pro machines, big cinema display, and Jobs playing with the font that was introduced as Apple's standard font shortly thereafter, in about 2000, something like that. He was playing with that and he's typing the names of his children, which I happen to know. So I wandered in. Katie Cotton, his minder of many years, took me in, introduced me, and I remarked on the names of the children on the screen and said, your children's names, do you miss them? And for about 2 or 3 minutes he explained how he hated travelling, he missed his family. And then we moved from there, sat over on a couple of couches, and we did the formal interview. But I thought the personal bit was too good to miss, because after all, I'm a working journalist. I've been taken in by the minder, been introduced to the subject, and as far as I'm concerned, from that point I'm working. So I wrote and led, it was a full page in the Age broadsheet, in the Age and Sydney Morning Herald, profile of Steve Jobs. And everybody at Apple seemed to like it, which was nice, except for Jobs. And I got a message through the grapevine from Katie Cotton saying, you're off Steve's Christmas card list. Why? He thinks you've intruded on his privacy and especially on his family. So I was P&G for about a year, I think, and then I was kind of forgiven, but I didn't see him again. But I used to see Tavanian and Rubenstein every trip, which was good, and Johnny Ive, because not that you ever were able to interview him, but I was always in company with Steve. You'd be in the Moscone Centre, which is enormous, great rabbit warren of meeting rooms and whatnot, in behind the auditoriums. And you'd be there waiting to go in and talk to Tavanian or somebody. And Jobs would be walking purposefully down, ignoring everybody. And in his wake was this little bloke who looked like an SAS stormtrooper in big boots and car keys, and he walked like this. He's actually very shy, and he was Jobs' constant companion and things like that. But as far as he's done a couple of interviews in London, and he's done one in the US that I know of. But other than that, the only time you see Johnny Ive face to face is in a video. And apparently making that video is quite painful for the video maker, because he's enormously shy and he forgets his lines and things like that. So, but that's speaking is not what he's good at. What he's good at, of course, as we all know, is design. And he now, especially since Tim Cook took over, Ive now, it would be, after Cook, probably one of the two most important people in Apple. So that's about the size of me. I spent until a couple of years back covering Apple for the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. But it became apparent that Fairfax, along with every other newspaper company, was having problems, and they're continuing to have problems. Some of them of their own making, in that they should have seen what was coming, in my humble view, not so humble, come to that. They should have seen what was coming 10 years before they did. Because people like me and a lot of other people, I have no particular insight, but a lot of things were happening. New York Times started a website. Rocky Mountain News closed down. Rocky Mountain News, by the way, is one of the oldest newspapers in the United States, highly respected, and they gave up, I think, probably 15 years ago. Couldn't get enough advertising revenue. Computer Age went from 28 broadsheet pages when I first started with it to 4 pages, and then basically to nothing, because it survived on job ads, which of course were taken by Seek.com. I don't think anybody really puts employment ads into a print publication anymore. So in the last 12 months, the Age, particularly, and the Sydney Morning Herald to some extent, have lost most of their experienced journalists, people like Warwick McFadgen and Steve Butcher and whatnot, all of whom were on pretty decent salaries. They were all swept out in one fell swoop one day about October of last year. They all went. There are a few left, but according to Bruce Guthrie, who's not necessarily a friend of Fairfax's, though he was editor of The Age for a while, he recently relieved himself of the view that the printed versions of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald would not last through 2016, which I think is a fair assessment of the current situation. 2 things about that. News is expensive, and secondly, news has become enormously fragmented. You've got News Corp and you've got Fairfax hanging in there on the web. But the assumption now seems to be that the 2 print publications will cease and the websites and the app will become the main vehicle. The problem with that, of course, is that there's not a lot of money in online ads. Google, for example, not a lot of money, but volume is what you get. The Guardian, for example, which has a staff here in Australia, is supported by a trust. It doesn't have to make a profit. On the other hand, the trust is getting slimmer by the day. In order to attract readers to the Fairfax site, the assumption seems to be that you have clickbait on the homepage. And I think that basically, for Age readers particularly, and Sydney Morning Herald readers particularly, that's a recipe for disaster. The people who read The Age, who read The Age, want something a bit better than, Man Bites Dog, for example, or what's happening in the fashion stakes at Flemington. I honestly don't know what's going to happen to them as a company, to any of the people from whom we get our information. I think radio has a good future. I think if we don't already see the ABC as possibly the saviour of a lot of things, despite, and I suppose it's a fair comment, despite what is to some extent a bit of bias in what they do, but by and large they do a pretty honest job, and we pay for it at 8-10 cents a day or whatever it is as taxpayers, and maybe that is going to be the best thing. Certainly in the UK, the BBC is supported by the television licence fee, and in a way that may be what we ultimately would have to do. But I think getting dispassionate, objective information, particularly out of Canberra, which is like it's like a sheltered workshop for backstabbers. It's just, you know, there are days when it's bad and there are other days when it's appalling. And not only recently, I mean, it goes, the last several years, Canberra has developed into this incestuous home of political backstabbing and backbiting and self-interest in a lot of sense. I mean, Mr. McFarlane was a good example of trying to feather your own nest. And I think the public has become, in general, seriously disaffected. Now, I think the media, to some extent, in its effort to be exciting as well as informative, has been responsible for some of that. But the distrust abroad in Australia, outside Canberra, is, I think, something to worry about, and that as a journalist of, I don't know, 6 decades, I worry about the kind of information we get. So this really wasn't much about Apple and yet, so people might like to ask questions, but thank you for listening.
Garry, while you wait there, there's a little appreciation. As you know, Gary's always been very kind to iMug, publicising our activities and referring people on to us and so forth. So he's always been a very good friend with iMug, and so we thought we'd reciprocate and show him the esteem with which we hold him and his friendship. So there's a small presentation for you, Garry.
This is a Apple console?
So I'll put it back in the trolley to take it back down to your car. A bonsai pomegranate.
Ah, wonderful, thank you.
And there's also a couple of little pomegranate trees, if you want, which are full size ones. So,
Oh, okay, yes.
yeah.
Lovely.
So
That's wonderful.
it's
Thank you. I
very
really
happy.
appreciate that.
No.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's gorgeous. Thank you.
Ken's grown it. He does quite a lot of bonsai, so yeah.
That's
So.
beautiful. Gorgeous. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you all.